to we're going to apply that to Susie's situation and her IEP and her special education services. All right. So we talked about hypervigilance, hyperarousal, attention issues, executive function issues. So I'm just going to, and how that affects a child in general, and then we'll look at it a little bit more about how it will impact them specifically in school. So academic performance is what we're talking about, but really it's also social, emotional, behavioral functioning, and just overall, how is the child coping with being in school? And we know that if they're not able to do that, they can't get to the academics, right? In order for a person to be able to engage in academics, they need to be regulated, they need to feel safe in their environment, and they need to be able to have the skills to do that. And then we get to the academics, right? So it's important to look at the academic issues in the IEP as well, but we need to make sure the traumatized child feels safe before we have these high expectations of them academically, which they just might not be in a space to access at all times. So impaired language and communication skills and social pragmatics. Oftentimes it is helpful to get a speech and language evaluation for a child who has experienced developmental trauma, because that part of their brain has been developed differently. It's normal for them, but it doesn't really help them to function in life and in the classroom too much. So social pragmatic language is very tied to social skills and understanding what people are saying and how to communicate back to them. So that can be super helpful. Executive function. So that's those frontal lobe area of the brain. It's like the CEO of the brain who tells everybody what to do and keeps things organized. And the working memory is there and holding a lot of things in the brain at once. So a lot of children who experience developmental trauma have a really tough time organizing their minds inside, let alone their outside environment. So we see kids who shove all this stuff in their backpack and they can't find things, or they forget their homework, or they forget to bring things home, or in school, throw out their work that they just did, right? Because they're having trouble figuring out what to do with it. Things like that happen as well. Changes in sensory perception. A lot of children who experience trauma have sensory issues. So an occupational therapy evaluation is often helpful. And just a little hint, some schools don't do the sensory part of the OT evaluation. They do a lot of fine and gross motor skill issues, handwriting, putting things together. I always specifically ask for it and ask for that to be included, because I've had times long ago, before I learned how to do that, when the focus was just really on fine and gross motor skills and cutting and holding a pencil, things like that. Those are important, right, for any child to be able to do well, but the sensory stuff is important. And that includes balance, right? Balance is a sensory issue. If you have a child who's falling over a lot, it might not be because they're being silly or misbehaving. It might be because they actually have sensory issues with balance or knowing where their body is in space. It's more than hearing. It's more than seeing, more than touching. We talked about kids having hyperarousal, oftentimes who had abuse or neglect in their life. And that generally looks like somebody being more sensitive to the environment. Sometimes it means being less sensitive. We see kids sometimes who bang their head on the wall or scratch themselves or pull their hair. That might be, and this is what the OT can help figure out, being not as reactive to the environment as is necessary, and their senses shutting down. A lot of times it looks the opposite. It looks like things that seem little to you and I might be really big to a child. So if they hear somebody chewing. I mean, it's none of us really like that a whole lot, right? But it might actually be to the point where they cannot concentrate, they cannot function, and they get really angry because that sounds really loud to them. It's not the kids just sort of making it up that it's annoying, but to them in their brain, that is very real. So being inattentive, because if you're hyper vigilant and wondering if a dog is going to come in the room and attack you, it's really hard to pay attention to your math or to what the teacher is saying, right? So inattentiveness is a big, has a really big impact in school. And then memory of cause and effect and sequencing events. So these are some of the impacts that we see. This is not a limited list. Like, this list could go on, but these are some of the more common things that we see and some of the evaluations that we can do to tease things out a little bit. So trauma really impacts kids' relationships, right? We talked a lot about attachment to caregivers, but it affects their relationship with peers. Most often, kids who have developmental trauma have a negative self-image. They can be aggressive, take risks. We see a lot of teenagers who go on the run and have, risky behaviors, more so possibly than their non-traumatized peers. They can have a really hard time taking other people's perspective, probably because people didn't take theirs, right? And they didn't learn that empathy and what it's like to be somebody else. And losing trust in a peer maybe more easily than some kids would. Having trust or not being able to build trust with adults or with the teacher, with the principal. So those relationships really need to be worked on. And then them feeling like they're going to be victimized again. So I've been victimized before, I'll probably be victimized again, even if they don't know that, consciously. So I'm going to just go in a little bit of a sidebar here again. Studies have shown, and I think anecdotally we see this, that if a child can connect with one trusted adult at school, it makes a huge difference. It could be the person in the cafeteria that talks to them every day when they go to lunch. It doesn't necessarily have to be their classroom teacher or the clinician. Sometimes kids see the counselor or the clinician as someone they don't want to trust because they've been to therapy and they don't like it. I'm not saying that's the sake for all kids. There could be that a child was abused by a woman with long blondish hair, and the teacher has long blondish hair, so finding a person and the school cultivating that the student is naturally drawn to and trusts can be super helpful. Sometimes with kids, it helps to check in with that person for a minute when they get to school, and just so they know that person's there. And then let's say that person's absent, then maybe we have another person who they also, is preferred over others. So those are some things that schools can do and education decision makers can talk about to help out a child. Like, who do they connect with at school, adult wise, also peers, right? But what I'm talking about, an adult, to help them feel safe at school and help them learn how to form a healthy connection. This is one of the reasons that kids who are in DCF custody and they're moving to different schools. Not only is it hard with peers, but they could lose a very trusted adult that they saw Monday through Friday and they talk to every Monday through Friday, who is their biggest champion, right? Kids form relationships with adults at school, and being taken out of that school and put in a different one can just disrupt that trust and disrupt relationships and a desire to have a rapport with adults. And again, a lot of the kids that we work with get moved, and the law actually leans towards kids not being, their schools staying the same when they are removed from their parents. That's a whole other training, but that's one of the reasons the school stability is there, not just for academics, but for those children as human beings to stay at a place where they have some connections. hopefully have connections. All right, so in the IEP, so we're going to go back to Susie's situation. And just so everybody knows, this is the current, or a lot of people are calling it the old IEP. We're over the summer, we'll change the training to reflect what this will look like in the new IEP, because in the fall, a new IEP is being rolled out. The laws haven't changed, but it's more integrated, more focused on the child, on strengths. So even though all of this information will be in the new IEP, it just looks a bit different. And one of the things I like about it is that it takes into consideration the child's vision when they're much, much younger, and it is incorporated into the IEP rather than being a transition planning form at the end. So concerns are here. And there are concerns that she doesn't have a connection or friends from school. She acts out, and the caregiver's concerned she will continue to be isolated, which will lead to increased depression. The education decision maker, in this case, I'm going to say it's the SESP, is concerned that her dysregulation or around feeling safe causes her to miss instruction in the classroom, especially in reading. There's something that's missing from this, and it's the students' concerns. So Susie, at the time that we're writing this IEP, I believe is between 13 and 15. And at the age of 14, students have the right to be present at all team meetings. And before then, they're often brought in. So even if Susie didn't attend the meeting, somebody should have talked to her about her own concerns about school, and they should really be in here. So that's something that is missing from this. Hopefully Susie will come to the meeting, but if she doesn't, the SESP or the ed decision maker can talk to her about it and kind of bring her voice to the table. All right, so these are some things that might be in the IEP, and we have to, you can yourself decide if you think this is too much information to be in the IEP, right? They talk a lot about her strengths at the beginning, and she does have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and adjustment disorder with anxiety due to her developmental trauma. It talks about how her disability includes some of these characteristics, especially in times of stress, and she has trouble reading social cues. It's difficult for her to make and retain friends. When she feels unsafe, she can become highly defensive or swears or lashes out, especially when she's reprimanded, right? So we're not just saying here that Susie is aggressive, Susie can't read social skills, Susie is defensive, Susie swears. It's not in a negative way. We're putting the real spin on this, that some of Susie's behaviors are due to the trauma, the developmental trauma, the PTSD, the adjustment issues, the anxiety. It's not just because Susie is a pain in the neck kid, right? So it doesn't go into a lot of details. It doesn't talk about her mom and her being left at home alone and some of the behaviors that she might have in the foster home that aren't relevant. It is noteworthy for sure that she had sexualized behaviors in the foster home. She's not exhibiting them in school as far as we know, and there would be other things that would be addressed, and hopefully that won't happen to her in school. But a lot of these things lead to being shut out by peers, and she's alone a lot at recess. That says a lot about what she is experiencing. And if this was a reevaluation, there would be more specific information from the evaluation reports in here. So this is a pretty general one, so we can address it and we can talk about it here rather than going into an hour's discussion about her evaluations. So the vision statement, she loves animals and cats. So she doesn't, even though we know she said she wants to be a veterinarian, she doesn't have to know that yet. And she can also change her mind. But so we're focusing on what is she like and what is she good at. And it says here that she would love to create a game on the computer that would be interesting to kids and help them understand math. So what I'm wondering here is, did they talk to Susie? It's very possible that they talked to Susie and that's what she said. She's not at the meeting, but this is talking about what she wants. What are her goals, her aspirations? And then for any student that's on an IEP, we look at what kind of skills do they need to achieve that vision, and what kind of support do they need to achieve that vision. Even though she's young and we're not getting into specific transition planning, it's important to start thinking about that. So present levels of educational performance, otherwise known as PLEP B. People talk about PLEP B and PLEP A. There's a lot of these things and accommodations would be in PLEP B. PLEP B and PLEP A are going away in the new IEP, and these things are going to be integrated in a different way, but we're going to talk about it, in terms of this current or old IEP. A lot of this was already articulated in the key evaluation results, so I'm not going to read it again, but the characteristics she has from her diagnosis are interfering a lot with her socially, emotionally, and she's not able to access the curriculum, and she's not doing well socially. It doesn't sound like she has friends, or she has a lot of conflict with friends. So this is what the PLEP B looks like, and we'll talk about what it would look like for Susie, right? So this is blank. This is the way a blank IEP comes with these different types of needs. But for her, she needs help during extracurricular, or support during extracurricular activities. So if she stays after for volleyball or the gardening club, it doesn't mean she doesn't need support during those things. She needs the same supports during those times as she does in school. And a lot of that could have to do with her executive functioning, her sensory issues, her issues with peers. Because extracurricular activities don't tend to be quite as structured. There's structure there, but they're not maybe as structured as the school environment. She has social emotional needs. She has communication needs, right? She yells, she swears, which is not conducive to learning for her or for anybody else. And it's just also not generally socially acceptable to do that. So she has needs in the area of communication and again, non-academic activities. So this is something I think should be clicked off for every child, because when we think of academics, we think of math, language arts, social studies, and science, right? Or maybe like a language, Latin, Spanish. Well, there's art, there's recess, there's the bus, there's physical education classes, there might be chorus, right? Sort of, we call electives. Well, the students needs accommodations during those times too, that they might not be encompassed in a goal, in a reading goal, in chorus if they're not doing any reading at all, in physical education if they're not doing any reading at all. She might not need her reading goals worked on during those times, but she certainly needs her social emotional needs strengthened during those times, during those classes. So we don't want to forget about those. So again, this is a blank form. What kinds of accommodations, if any, is necessary for her to make progress? So again, I'm going to ask people to chime in. If you don't want to chime in, it's okay. But what do we think for Susie with accommodations? I think they're necessary. So I think we can assume that they're necessary. But what do people have thoughts about accommodations that she might need? And it's hard to remember exactly what was going on with her. So here's some examples. So priority seating, and I like this. We talked about this before, where Susie feels most comfortable, not where the teacher decided is most comfortable for her, but the student and the teacher can talk, and the student can tell the teacher, and the teacher can see how Susie's doing there, and they can find a place for Susie to sit where she feels comfortable and she can do well and better pay attention than she would have if she was there otherwise. have a recess monitor be out there facilitating her interactions and give her positive feedback. And maybe that person can kind of help her figure out how to get involved in groups of other kids, or even playing with one child. So not just send her out there at recess on her own to figure it out, but to actually give her some support during recess, which is a very unstructured time. So this, encouraging her to use self-calming or anxiety reducing techniques, those are usually taught by an adjustment counselor, but they can be implemented throughout the day. And if the teacher knows what Susie's doing and what helps her, a very, very common tool are fidget toys, right? We see those all over the place now, or sensory boxes with things on it that kids like to hold or look at while they're doing their work or while they're sitting and listening. And even if the school counselor kind of helps Susie figure that out, that can be done anywhere. Susie can carry around a stress ball in her pocket, or there can always be some made available to her in every room. So again, I talked about this a little bit before, but seeking help from a specific staff member when they're feeling anxious. And here it says with mental health expertise, that's ideal, right? But Susie might just need a little attention and want to go talk to the assistant principal who doesn't necessarily have mental health expertise. They have experience as an adult and as an educator, but maybe that's a person Susie connects with and can go see that person when she's feeling anxious. Breaks, I think that this is probably in every IEP, or just about, breaks with check-ins. So these can be planned breaks. They can be breaks when the student asks. Sometimes limits need to be put on them because some students might ask for 17 breaks in 15 minutes, right? So that is something that has to be worked on with the child. That doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, every 2 minutes they can take a break, but you know what? If getting them back into school, if that's what they require at first, then that's what they require at first. And we can always scale it back and work on having the breaks be taken less frequently. Sensory and gross motor breaks. Taking a break for some kids, it could be coloring, but for other kids, that doesn't work because they're sitting down and they're not moving around. So most people, I'm sure a lot of you got up during our 5-minute break. You might not have done jumping jacks, but probably you walked to the kitchen. It helps just to get up and move around. Sometimes it can be for 5 minutes. Sometimes it can be to go for a child at school into a sensory room, like a break room where it's quiet, or kind of a calm down room. One of the ways that the students can tell the teacher that they want to take a break is with it. Here it says a cool off card. It could be called whatever the student wants, but they can, when they're feeling overwhelmed, they can give the teacher a signal or put the card on the teacher's desk. Especially if they're uncomfortable saying, "Hi teacher, I need a break," and they don't want to say it maybe in front of other kids, that's something that can be put in an IEP, that this is the way the student communicates that they need a break. And sometimes kids might need a one-to-one aid with a paraprofessional. That's pretty restrictive, right? So we don't want to go right for that. Sometimes a child might need it for a little bit and then be able to wean off of that. But it's not something we necessarily want to go for right away. If it depends on if the child's able, their level of functioning, but it's something to consider. And obviously that would be written into an IEP. Other accommodations, small groups, right? So Susie might, and I'm not saying she does, need to be in a therapeutic day school with really, really, really small classes. And maybe she does function in a regular education setting, but she needs some of her classes to be small, or she needs a specific class to be small. She can sit on one of those big balls you use in yoga. I can't remember what a fitness ball. Yeah, that's what it says here. Allow the student to help others. peers helping peers. Susie has strengths. She's good in math and science. She likes soccer. She could help somebody during gym class with her soccer skills. She could be a peer mentor for kids in math and help younger students or her peers. We also want to look at Susie as a person who has strengths and skills, right? Susie struggles because she had trauma, but she also has a lot of good things to share with in the school environment and with her community. We talked about sensory. A lot of kids will have our teachers will have a sensory box, and it can be there for everybody. Susie might have her own, but Susie might not want her own because sometimes it can be embarrassing. So the teacher could have just a sensory box in the classroom that anybody can access, but maybe Susie does it a little bit more. This is why taking away recess, in my opinion, is a terrible thing. So taking away recess, I think, should be outlawed, because all kids need recess, all kids need to move around, and some kids more than others. So saying to a child who is dysregulated and moving all over the place during math, telling them to stay inside from recess to do their math is ludicrous, right? So we want that might not necessarily be in an IEP, but we want that discussed with the teacher, that is a totally inappropriate thing for Susie or most kids actually to do, taking away recess. Let Susie decide where she wants to eat and with who. Give her some voice, right? Give her some choices. A smaller area to play in with some things that she likes to do. And again, that could be in kind of a break room. Or let's make sure she really likes to play basketball. Let's make sure that there's a couple basketballs out there at recess. Let her sit near the back of the room at assemblies. If assemblies are super overwhelming for her and she has sensory issues, she might need to go with an adult and leave, or maybe it's a little bit less noisy back there, but consider in those big situations, where is she going to be most successful? And then, since she has trouble with peers, a buddy at recess or lunch especially, or somebody to walk with. This can be a little tricky sometimes to choose a student, and a student who wants to be a buddy. There are things like lunch bunches and we can at a lunch bunch with the school counselor, we can maybe let Susie choose a friend who's not usually in the lunch bunch to come. So we need to think outside the box, and there are some seemingly these seem little, but they can be really big and make a really huge difference for a student. All right, so goals that might be appropriate for a student with a trauma history. So we know that all kids are different and they have different goals, and kids might have academic goals for sure, but there are some things that kids with trauma generally have a hard time with and can be worked on as part of the IEP through goals and measurable outcomes, and progress reports, and discussed at team meetings and tweaked. And we can weave that right into the IEP. So we've already talked about a lot of these: coping skills, regulating emotions, self-regulation. All of these can be the name of a goal, right? The kids can specifically work on some of these issues during the school day. Some of these might be put together, like self-control and self-monitoring might be put together. Some kids have aggression, anxiety. Some kids make negative comments and gestures, or sexualized gestures. There can be ways in an IEP to address those things. Being non-compliant, having trouble following directions. We've talked about this a lot: interacting with peers and social skills. And that can be done both formally and informally. That might mean that a paraprofessional sits there when the child is working in a group to facilitate the group, and especially that child. Problem solving, organizing materials. They can have somebody maybe go through their backpack with them at the end of the day to figure out what they need to bring back to the group home. Obviously, this might be with younger kids. I don't know that older kids would go for that, but there can be a checklist of things that they need to bring home or things that they need to do when they get to school in the morning. And then a big one is self-advocacy skills. This is one of the reasons this is really big. Kids in DCF custody, especially those who age out, have very little, if any, support from family, community, friends. This is a great skill for anybody to develop, but for the kids that we work with, they tend to have less support. So learning how to advocate for oneself is a really essential skill. And I often have self-advocacy for my kids with trauma in as a goal, because it is crucial. And also when they get to the transition portion and they're starting to get to the point where they're leaving school, it becomes even that much more important. All right, so this is just some reminders before we close out. The assessments need to be trauma informed, and that oftentimes will be helpful through an evaluation. It doesn't have to be a neuropsychological evaluation. Those are great to have. But also for some kids, it's not a reality. It doesn't happen because of funding. And DCF will often fund neuropsychological evaluations. Sometimes the waiting lists are years because they're done through Mass Health. Sometimes the court will give money for a neuropsychological evaluation that's arranged through the child. It's requested and arranged by the child's care and protection attorney. So we don't want to always assume that a child with trauma gets a neuropsych, but the people at the school who are doing this, especially the cognitive and social, emotional, behavioral evaluations, can consider that as well. So behavior is a form of communication. It means that there are skills there that are not present and the child is struggling to cope. So when somebody else said, I think it was Safita said, there's a reason behind the behavior, right? The child was falling asleep at school for a reason. And when the reason was uncovered, everybody, the adults were able to support the student in achieving success in school and not going to sleep in school. And that could be applied to many other types of behaviors that kids exhibit. We can start working on self-advocacy in preschool, right? We can start having a student ask the teacher a question when they're stuck. That's self-advocacy, just asking for help with, the child is in kindergarten and they're having trouble with 1 + 2. Going up to the teacher and saying, I need help, I don't know how to do this, is self-advocacy. And oftentimes, so I'm specifically talking to the special education surrogate parents out there, but there are times when the SESP is one of the most consistent people in a child's life. And sometimes the school is the most consistent setting for a child, for those who don't move around as much. So just keep that in mind, because you're a person who can get to know the student really well and always be there. And kids in DCF custody, their social workers change a lot. Foster parents can change. Like I said, schools can change, but the special education decision maker can remain there, which is why we ask people to stay on a case until the case is done, so that the education decision maker doesn't change as well. And so RTSC, the Recruitment Training and Support Center, we are here to answer questions and for support. So please reach out to us. And I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. If you want to also become a special education surrogate parent, you can call us, but this is a way that you can call for support and email us for support. We have the orientations for people who want to become a special education surrogate parent. We really need people in central and western Massachusetts right now. A lot of things can be done remotely, but it's helpful if the SESP is in the same general area as the child. So we have those orientations. We have, like I said, this trauma training once a month. We have a discipline and suspension training every month. And then we have a transition training every month. We have a news